Hello everyone and welcome to my podcast, Human Rights, How Do They Stack Up? Where we explore different aspects of the legal system and whether they uphold or undermine human rights. With every episode there will be a survey attached in the description so you can feedback whether you liked it, whether there's anything you would suggest to improve, so please do fill that in once you've listened to the episode, and enjoy! So I'm starting this episode off with a particularly relevant quote. The justice of society has two dimensions, social and political. Social justice dictates how well members should compare with one another within the basic structure of the society. Political justice dictates how far they should share in controlling the shape of that basic structure. This came from a political philosophy textbook, and admittedly takes a couple of seconds to digest. I interpret it as social justice dictates the norms and values within a society, while political justice refers to the extent that certain members of society can manipulate and reconfigure that basic structure, which I perceive as the justice system, which encases and embodies our norms and values. Within this definition, it's not inconceivable that there is the potential for a mismatch between social justice and political justice, where justice systems struggle to uphold societal norms and values. Of course, with human institutions come human flaws, and with justice comes politics. But to what extent does our political system influence the carriage of justice? One example is the US Supreme Court. Article 2 of the US Constitution grants the President the power to submit a nomination, who is then approved by the Senate to ensure checks and balances of power. However, Supreme Court justices serve lifelong terms, making presidential nominations highly consequential, especially considering that they nominate those with similar ideological patterns. Recently, we've been seeing partisan divisions within nominations. For example, the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh restored a conservative majority of 5-4. At only 53, he's likely to remain for a significant period of time. Most recently, Trump's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to replace the late Ruth Ginsburg was particularly contentious due to its speed and restoration of a 6-3 conservative majority. Meanwhile, in Uttar Pradesh, India, an emergency law was enacted to prevent interfaith unions by condemning religious conversion for marriage with up to 5 years in prison. The ruling BJP party has defended its action as a counter to love jihad, the conspiracy that Muslim men seduce and convert Hindu girls for marriage in order to diminish the demographic majority of Hindus. Keep in mind though that in Uttar Pradesh, Hindus make up 80% of the population, whereas Muslims only make up 14%. Yet, similar emergency laws have been declared in 4 other BJP-ruled states, as BJP's legislative approach to shifting demographics perpetuate this idea of a Muslim threat to Hindu society. I think Professor Mahmoodabad sums it up nicely. The law is giving legal credibility to a conspiracy theory. Even Finland, often portrayed as a progressive nation with its new coalition led by 5 women, hinders the rights of transgender individuals. This, and I quote, backward trans act has been campaigned against for years, and past governments have attempted reforms which have buckled due to conservative pressure. Furthermore, the ambitious equality programme brought in by Marin's new coalition fails to address race-related suffering, with Finland's rate of racist harassment of African descendants being the highest in Europe. These are just a few examples of the imposition of politics on the justice system, and how this impacts human rights. Rather than just hearing me talk about this, though, I wanted to bring in some other perspectives on the influence of politics on the justice system. So I brought together some of my fellow students to discuss the questions surrounding China and how its politics and judiciary intertwine.
So hello everyone. Today we are going to be doing a discussion panel and we're talking with Bella, Richard, Nina and Alex. And this episode is all about politics and justice. And I feel like a key example of that is China, which is commonly known as an authoritarian state. And so I want to first start off with Beijing's security law, which was introduced last year. And so we're looking at these vague and ambiguous terms imposed upon freedom of speech, freedom of press, and all that sort of thing. Richard, do you want to start with a comment upon Beijing's security law?
Yeah, of course. Well, obviously what we have is the British hand over Hong Kong in the 90s to China after its lease has expired. And Hong Kong remains a relatively free state considering the rest of the state of China. However, as the years go on, the British influence over China wanes, and British influence over Hong Kong wanes, and you have the introduction of more authoritarianism into Hong Kong as it looks less like the babies in the security laws, which you mentioned beforehand. And this is essentially the beginning of what I see as a move towards authoritarianism and perhaps a more totalitarian, if one can use that word, state within Hong Kong. And this is obviously very worrying because former British colony, once again, we've seen this pattern throughout history, a former British colony moving towards authoritarianism as a solution, or in this case, it will be an imperialist fashion with which authoritarianism is being imposed. And I think it's incredibly worrying. And it subverts democratic rights, freedom to protest, freedom of speech, but of course, freedom to vote as well. And as we've seen in the past few months, even, and especially last year, there were multiple arrests of pro-democracy politicians and pro-democracy protests being violently shut down by Chinese security forces. And I think it's terribly, terribly dangerous. And it's a symbol of what China can do. If China is able to take what was an incredibly prosperous place, an incredibly liberal, in fact, let's put it like that, place, and that's in both the sense of classical and modern, China has managed to exert its influence so heavily, so quickly, that it's a symbol of the imperialism and the swiftness of the sword with which China can hit other nations. And there is my comment.
Did anyone else have a comment on that? Anything else to add on? Well, I guess
that's a pretty comprehensive opening statement, I think.
Yeah, you always summarize it well, Richard.
Thank you.
I guess what was of particular concern to me was this imposition of the executive upon the judiciary. Within, let's say, UK, you have those kind of checks and balances between these different branches of a nation. And here, well, that's just been thrown to the wind, basically. And that's been represented within UK lawyers based in Hong Kong who have said, we won't be a part of this, and therefore left. And so you're almost left with this kind of like, I want to say carcass left behind, not quite to that stage yet, but you can see that is what it's slowly evolving to be, where Hong Kong's infamously independent judiciary is almost kind of withering away. And I guess it's kind of, how do we respond to that? How does the UK respond to that? Did anyone have any thoughts on that? How we can almost tackle this issue?
I mean, one interesting thing is obviously if you look at when Hong Kong was when British colonial rule stopped, the idea was, so it's something like that. At first it was, I don't know the percentage, but a certain amount of the voting rights went to kind of corporations and businesses, and the other part went to the people, because they, there wasn't security in this newfound nation. That was the idea, is to get that stability up, and the idea was to slowly graduate into a pure, actually democratic society, which I think actually a lot of Hong Kongers wanted themselves. That was it. It's the one, what's it called, the one state two system, what's the word?
One state, two systems.
Is that the correct statement? Is that the correct way to phrase it? Yeah, there we go. But
one China, two systems.
There you go, to distinguish between the two of them. And obviously that just simply hasn't happened. I think they haven't reduced the amount of actually democratic seats, but I think it's still at a point where the influence of those is just so marginalized, and that's only being pushed further by these new additions. And there isn't therefore the power of the people to be able to say, no, we don't want this, apart from through means of protest, which are being very much quashed. And even though it's raising international concern, there's still the issue of how much can other countries do. You see England saying, Hong Kong nationals are allowed to have British passports, and then obviously due to the coronavirus, I'm sure that really limited the amount of people who took up that opportunity. But there's still a question of, is that really, that seems like just a response to it rather than a solution. It's like, as much as it's well and good to provide them somewhere else to go, really we want to be improving the situation in Hong Kong rather than just providing an alternative. And then the question is, how does England, or how does the rest of the world get involved with that? And to what point should countries like America get involved? Where is their responsibility lying? You could argue England is much more involved due to the past, but other Western powers, where is their involvement, and where does that cut off?
I think it's very tricky, because the reality is that the Chinese government does not want a separation of powers, because it is not a democratic state. It is a totalitarian / authoritarian regime, and it is perfectly within their interests to have no separation of powers, because it means that they can keep their state under control. And I think that's where there's always been a source of conflict, because Hong Kong has always valued its freedom. It's always been seen as almost kind of within this huge state, it's always been seen as an area of relative freedom, and always kind of has been. So to see it taken away, you can see that there are huge protests, you can see that there are activists trying to change this. But the reality is that China is such a dominant superpower within the world, it is unlikely that any politician is going to feel like they want to act purely for political reasons, not necessarily because of what is right or wrong, but because a huge amount of trade and goods and services still come from China, and that gives it a very strong position, which is not necessarily conducive towards making sure that people have democratic freedoms, and that is a shame.
It's also because China is huge, and a lot of trade is done with China, you're right. So we can impose a few sanctions here and there, but it also China's just massive, and it is a hideously authoritarian regime that's not really interested in pretending to be that it's pretending not to be. It's not really trying to give an image of being anything other than it is. So you can't shame them, and it is really difficult to actually do anything that can really put the thumbscrews on them. You can impose a few sanctions here and there, but we can't really do anything massive to try and get them to change their ways, unless you fancy rolling the tanks in, which is not a good idea that's not going to solve any problems anyway. All you were going to end up doing is massacring a few people, most of whom will be conscripts anyway. So that's not really going to work. It is difficult. I mean, the economic route would be the first thing you think of, but China's dominance is economic, really. They're not like other powers have been. They're not a bit like the Soviet Union. They're not interested in trying to spread communism or something like that. China's dominance is economic, and that's about it, really. They're not interested in doing anything else except, and they're being pretty successful anyway in their economic dominance thus far. I mean, you only have to look at any like plastic toys and all that stuff. They've all got "Made in China" stamped on the back of them. We're all doing this on computers. And at least half the parts in our computers have probably got "Made in China" written on them as well, because the labour costs are quite cheap there, and so lots of people get their stuff from there. I think the only way you can really kind of act at the moment. You can condemn the government, as lots of people have done, which is, I mean, that's kind of a given that people in a democratic system are going to say to an authoritarian regime, we don't like you very much. That's just kind of par for the course. I don't think really you can do anything major without simply ceasing trade ties with them, but you can't. Doing that would mean we'd have to find alternative sources of a lot of the stuff we get from them, and that's very difficult because they make a lot of shit, really.
And I guess, let's say in theory, we did manage to kind of intervene in China. The question is, how would you actually find a genuine solution? You're talking about essentially reorganizing the entire political system in order to ensure democratic rights, because what's happened is with this new security law, they've essentially waived basic rights. So you can have your right to jury by trial completely dismissed. So is it actually possible for, even through state intervention, to get a genuine solution to happen in China?
I mean, the Chinese government is not going to do it on its own. So it would be very difficult for anyone to exert any form of international pressure that would convince the Chinese government to do anything towards introducing democracy, I think, because that's not the way China works, is definitely not democratic, and they're not interested in imposing anything like that. So other countries, I don't think they would be able to intervene in a way that would be able to make something like that happen, that would be able to get not only make secure democracy in Hong Kong or get China to adopt democracy generally. I don't know if there's any way you could do that. Within China would seem like a more likely solution. You have a lot of pro-democracy politicians, and there's a lot of pro-democracy protests which are pretty potent in Hong Kong. Giving that people like that support might be a way for other countries to try and get democracy going in China, I would say. That might be a way to do it. But you can't really do that much from the outside of it, really, because it is an issue within the nation, and the people who are in charge of China at the moment are not interested in having it in any form of democracy. So you kind of have to make them, really.
I think the problem with China is it's much like the Soviet Union, in the sense of it was a communist state, now obviously embracing market principles, which is what has made it unashamedly an absolute economic titan, only to be compared with the likes of America. And I think that if we're going to expect democracy to ever arrive in China, as it did obviously before the revolution of Mao Zedong, then you're going to have to see China fall. And if we're going to look at history, that's going to come internally more than externally, and that's going to come from a leader. Obviously, the fall of the USSR was prompted by the liberalization thereof, the end of the sort of Brezhnev re-Stalinization period and the head towards glasnost and perestroika under Gorbachev. And so I think if we're going to see China embrace democracy and or split itself and or not become what it is now, we're going to have to see some sort of perhaps final revolution, in terms of perhaps it won't be particularly bloody, perhaps it will be a political revolution, but it will be a revolution nonetheless. And I believe that a state like China, a state that is authoritarian, that controls the lives of its citizens, that strip them of their civil liberties, it is inevitable that will have to be taken by extreme force. I think that's just the way it's always been, and that's the way it's always going to be, unless you want to wait sort of this in 1984, the 1,000 years that O'Brien talks about when they're in his office. If it's going to happen, it's got to happen now. Not now in the sense of right now in 2021, but it's going to have to happen before China can even further consolidate its position, because China is spreading across the globe. It is economically imperialist ever since it's essentially taken up its market strategies. It's moving into Africa, and it's becoming more dominant in other parts of Asia as well. And I think that if we're going to stop China, then it's going to have to be through exertion of pressure from the West in terms of economics, but it's going to have to be from within. That's where the political pressure is going to have to come from, or else there's just no point in the West doing anything at all.
But I think the interesting thing also is with exerting economic pressure is that it's to the stage of globalization where if you start exerting pressure on China, that's going to come straight back into our face. I think that was very, very clear with the America-China trade war. It didn't really, it was equally inconvenient for both sides. And I think another thing to remember is that, as you mentioned with Africa, not only in damaging China do we damage ourselves, we actually damage growing economies, which really the West has a history. A lot of the West were the colonizers, and that take a certain level of responsibility now to trying to get them back up on their feet again. And interestingly, it's China which is arguably making the most proactive changes, with their kind of lack of interest in how they're making the most proactive change in the way of economics. Not necessarily perhaps in the way of political stability. Then the issue is if you start attacking China, you do bring genuinely the rest of the world with you. And not that isn't, I still see China as a threat. I still see it as something which does need to be addressed, but I think it's another level of where you need to be careful around, because it is ultimately going to have a global effect, and there will be pushback, and there'll be very understandable pushback from countries which simply can't handle almost this international turmoil because they're still trying to just get onto the global market, if that makes sense, and have only been doing so through China's help, for instance.
Yeah, it would. If you do, there are economies like that in Africa that are essentially dependent on China's aid. So if you were to put the thumbscrews on China, it would affect them potentially, yeah. Which is a problem with it. Again, China's got a very wide, far-reaching economic influence. So if you do try and affect its economy being affected is going to affect global economies as well, because it has just such a far-reaching influence. Which is, again, why probably more of the change is going to have to come from within China rather than external pressure, because you're right. Putting external pressure on it can have other effects rather than just on the Chinese government. And I think, to be honest, being realistic, there is a limited amount of economic pressure we can really put on them. I don't think we could ever put on sufficient economic pressure that would actually make them change like this. I think, to be honest, it may even stiffen their resolve. They're going, well, look at all these Western systems, we're not going to acquiesce to their demand. You don't, every time, there's a lot of things in history when people have tried through various means to try and force concessions from people. Sometimes it works, but other times they hate you even more because you're trying to put them through something else.
I think a key, bringing it back almost to the security law and the kind of idea that change has to come from within, you have almost like this conflict between it has to come from within because there is limited amounts that we as outsiders can do, plus a security law which basically ruthlessly suppresses opposition and basically takes away right to free trial, etc., etc. So you have this kind of really kind of awful situation where the people of China need to do something about it, yet know if they do, they will probably be put in prison for the rest of their life. And I think fear is quite a powerful tool which they have used on numerous occasions to try and further their cause. But yeah, it's an interesting one.
I mean, one thing I'd also mention is we've got to appreciate how limited our viewpoint is of this, right? China has such control over the press. God knows how many revolutionaries there are. God knows how, we simply don't have access to that in the West, maybe our grandkids, after the fall of it, maybe they'll be learning all about these great things, but we simply don't have access. We ultimately do actually mainly see what China is willing to put out. Obviously, we do see certain big things, but I think a lot of the internal instability is going to be cleared away because, especially for economic value, it's not good for your economy to be seen as an unstable state. The market doesn't really care if you're a dictatorship or an authoritarian or democratic, as long as you are stable. And therefore, it's in their interest economically, let alone politically, to seem as politically stable as possible. So I think, we don't necessarily actually understand the full implications of this because we simply don't have access to what it is like. Obviously, there are some reports, and there are going to be some people British people living in Hong Kong who are experiencing it firsthand. But I still argue that's a very limited perspective of it compared to what you would get, say, in like a less established or less controlling system or regime.
Yeah, you're certainly not going to get much information leaking out from a regime that has such a tight fist on it, and especially not going to get an idea of much idea of what life on the ground's like, because they don't want you to see what life on the ground's like. That's not what because they tightly control their citizens' information, and equally they're going to try and control any information that leaks out from them. They want to make sure that people don't really see that.
Well, I mean, the true question is then, are we headed for a second Cold War? Is there going to be further espionage? Who are going to be the aggressors? Is China, I know I go on about history a lot, but that's because it's important. Is China going to become the Soviet Union in the sense of, is there going to be a Western either coalition or a major power like the US, most likely, that is going to involve itself in a sort of semi-conflict with China under the radar? And is there going to be surveillance? Is there going to be espionage? Is there going to be all the sort of the hallmarks of a Cold War? Or is it going to be an all-out conflict? Because eventually all this stuff has to come to a head, because it always does. And is that going to be fierce, or is that going to be more low-lying?
I think it's unlikely in the modern world, and I sincerely hope I'm right in this. I think it is unlikely in the kind of nuclear age that we live in that there will be an all-out conflict. I think if you probably asked government, there probably is already espionage going on. I don't know. I don't work for the government. I'm not MI6.
Or are you?
Or am I? Yeah. No, I'm not. But it's probably going on. Let's be realistic here. Just because we don't hear about it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening. And
if we heard about it, then we wouldn't be very good at it.
Exactly. It wouldn't exactly be a secret service, would it, if it wasn't secret? Yeah. But I think a Cold War is potentially, but I think whilst China still has this utter dominance in the economic markets, I don't know whether, and it is starting to wane if you look at the statistics, only a little. But whilst China is still economically as strong as it is, I do not believe that there will be many challenges from different sides, especially not in the short term. I don't know about the long term. It's all hypotheticals, really.
Whatever conflict there is, I think will be just purely economic. I don't think we'll ever get a situation where it's anywhere near military, because for two reasons. Like you said, in a nuclear age, no one wants to press that button, and particularly when it's a military conflict is not conducive to having a stable economy, really, because it's expensive, and you don't really, as a nation, you're not really going to get anything massive out of a war unless you totally annihilate your enemy and they've got a lot of conveniently placed things left over for you to take at the end of it. A war is not generally profitable unless you're an arms dealer. For a nation, unless you've got booty to take at the end of it, you can make a massive loss on a war. You lose a lot of manpower because they all get mown down by machine guns. You lose a lot of things you make very quickly. You have to gear your whole economy towards it. And then at the end of it, you kind of have to pick up the pieces around that. And I don't think China's interested in that either, because if its dominance is economic, and I don't think it would ever see the benefit of an actual war, and we wouldn't want one here either. To be honest, I'm not really sure it would make an impact anyway, because China's massive and they've got one of the most densely populated countries on Earth. If there ever was a war, you'd be up against a hell of a lot of people. I think probably a Cold War situation probably would arise. I think it will be completely economic. I think the main difference between China and the Soviet Union, really, is that the Soviet Union struggled throughout its entire existence. Its economy was never anywhere near as big as China. Basically, the primary difference between China and the Soviet Union is that China's got a successful economy. The Soviet Union was limping the whole way. I mean, you saw that in loads of different ways. China's weird because it's got reasonable living standards for a dictatorship. It's got pretty good living standards in a lot of its cities. Although you have no freedoms, obviously, but economically speaking, it's reasonable. bearing
Yes.
in mind it's an authoritarian dictatorship. The Soviet Union was, I mean, you had ridiculously bad living standards in some areas. The tanks they were churning out for the battlefield were like, they just made as many as they could, and the workmanship was ridiculously bad on them, and it was all like a load of crudely welded pig iron. And the economy ended up collapsing in the Soviet Union quite dramatically towards the early 90s, whereas China has actually created itself a successful economy. And that's why it's got.
But then one thing I'd mention is obviously you've got the work camps, which has. So yes, maybe for the citizen China wants to display them having, and the citizens China respects as humans, right? There is a decent standard of living that sadly is not accountable for every single person who lives in China. You know, I don't even know how many million.
No.
And so I wonder whether, you know, they've sidestepped that issue of the Soviet Union by deciding, okay, right, we're just gonna have this group have the bad living standards to prop up this kind of a dictatorship. You know, maybe they've just shifted it and condensed that kind of lack of living standard into a relatively smaller, it's still a huge number of people, obviously, but we are talking about China, the country with the biggest population in the world, so it makes sense that, you know, you've got to keep an eye on that. And so maybe that is how they've done it. They kind of, it's almost, they're like, oh, just take one for the team. Obviously that's horrific and it's not acceptable at all, but that might explain how they are seemingly doing better than Russia, because they have instead very much penalized a certain group. I don't know a huge amount about the Soviet Union, so do please correct me if I'm wrong or check my facts. I'm just throwing it out there.
I think also, and I'm just comparing the two, I would agree that there are still huge amounts of people that are living in desperate poverty or work camps, which is obviously even worse. But then the time the Soviet Union was around, you had a lot of other economies which were booming or doing very well. I mean, you have places like the FRG, the US, places which were, and obviously the US is still economically prosperous, but China, especially when it boomed, was the only real huge economy that was doing amazingly well, and it's kind of fueled that growth even further. And I wonder whether that's kind of more of the difference of kind of almost circumstance, and chance plays a part in so much in history.
Because I think you might have a point. China's boom was fairly recent, I think. Basically, their economy was on its knees and people were starving until around, I can't remember exactly how long, it was around 15 years ago. And then basically they have a bit of a shake-up. You have things like state-sponsored capitalism, and they finally have a bit of cash in their pockets after that, and people aren't starving anymore. Which is, again, different to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union never had a bit of that shake-up. I think China, I'm not an economist, but my dad is, so he bangs on about this stuff all the time. But I think China's main economic strength has really been that they've found a way to kind of finance themselves, and they've got themselves a system where they can have an economy that can be a sort of closed economy whilst relying on pockets that don't quite work the same way. And then it's kind of got itself economic dominance based on that, rather than trying to finance a recovery based on other nations. It's kind of taken matters into its own hands, and now it's ended up with an economy where it's in the position it's giving aid to African nations, and it's making a difference globally.
I think if we're going to make economic comparisons, perhaps China's economy is most comparable with the Third Reich, the Nazi economy, in the sense of there's sort of moderated capitalism with members of the Chinese government at the head or close there to the top companies within China. And that's obviously because where you need, in a state like China, you have to have control over the companies which be, so that you can retain control of the state, so that they're not governed by the market. And then you have to sort of have massive revenue come from your population to subsidize your, shall we say, schemes or in governance. And I think that China is, as you say, one of the most recent countries to boom economically. And I think that always scares people, is when there's sort of like a threat from another power that is emerging. China has obviously emerged as an unbelievably dominant one, and perhaps we don't even recognize how dominant China is because we just see it so much, we become desensitized to it. And I think that is what really lies at the heart of the threat to the West is perhaps the spread of Chinese political system by means of the prosperity of its economy. And if China can show itself to be more prosperous than the West, and it can show itself to be more efficient, more brilliant, more vibrant than the West as a political system, then that is what is really threatening. And there are many people. I mean, it's not just the dark corners of the internet anymore that bleat on about Maoism and how wonderful it was and why we need an authoritarian state. There is a rise in authoritarianism caused by the economic crises, caused by feelings of malcontent because they have no one else to blame anything for. And I think that is and if China could exploit that fear, which they've been doing, then that is what is going to be very, very threatening to liberalism in general in the West.
Yeah, I still think that in well-established liberal countries, I don't know whether there's, and I get your point in like less developed countries and countries where that could be this regimes that are less stable, but I don't know whether it could ever be the case, for example, in Britain, say, like, I don't know whether that could potentially, I think we have too entrenched in this country our rights. And I mean, could you imagine them in America trying to overturn the bill like rights and the Constitution as they knew it? There would be uproar. They can't even change a bill on gun control, which is killing their citizens. I don't know whether it, in more established kind of liberal democracies, whatever the other threats of kind of Trumpism and things like that, I don't know whether it could fully take hold in the same kind of way. I don't know whether China is that clever.
I don't see Trumpism as a threat to democracy anyway, but
No.
I mean, I understand what you mean. I think there will always be certain countries, Britain and the USA, that will never sort of come to this, but there are certain countries within the West which are susceptible to these kind of things and are susceptible to certain policies and certain figures that would perhaps be more veering towards authoritarianism than I would perhaps like. I'm thinking here of Viktor Orban and, of course, Salvini in Italy. And that is where I see where China could capitalize. It's the want for that sort of more nationalistic right. And I think that they could easily be capitalized upon by China with authoritarian tendencies and sort of almost invade like a virus to into the political sort of mean as an acceptable alternative. Obviously, China is an alternative, and it would be a viable alternative, as horrific as it would be, and it would be an efficient alternative. Because let's not kid ourselves. China is a highly successful country, and its political system does work, despite the fact it obviously deprives its citizens of liberties, etc., etc. And I think if it can be seen as a reasonable alternative to Western liberalism in certain countries, then I think the real threat lies in. And I think that this is sort of mirroring. If it were to happen, it would mirror the sort of the communist parties within certain countries in the West, which became rather popular. It has to be said, in countries like France and Spain, they actually did become sort of relatively popular and well known.
You do, yeah. There is a danger, I think, of some countries that don't necessarily always have a tradition of democracy that are more inclined. There are some countries that are more inclined to go authoritarian. There is probably a danger in them seeing the China model as a bit more attractive. I do think Izzy's right, though. In countries like us as well, we wouldn't ever do that. In our country, we don't tolerate dictatorship. We never have. I mean, there's a famous, we've never liked anything like that, because I think some countries do go about it differently. America have their constitution, and their nation was founded very recently in terms of the planet and the universe. It was founded relatively recently, and it was founded out of people who essentially wanted freedom from other people. So it's got a constitution that's about individual freedom and stuff like that, and Americans generally like their constitution. Of course, the attitudes do vary because it's a massive country, but yeah, you do have that entrenched thing about individual liberty, and they don't like people having authority over them. And we have a similar thing, although we go about it differently. We've never liked dictatorships or anything like that. I mean, that goes back quite a long way. You had like the Battle of Cable Street, which was a long time ago now, which is essentially a bunch of nutcases called the British Union of Fascists marched into London, and the Cockneys came out and threw stones at them. And these are Cockneys who, at this point, are living in living standards we call Victorian, which are just horrific living standards. But these people still threw stones at fascists because they just said, "Not here, never here. Thank you very much." And the police, it would almost be funny if it didn't result in people getting hurt. But the actual battle came from the police having to protect fascists from all the Cockneys who were throwing stones at barricades at them. That's where the battle of Cable Street came from. So we've never liked that. And look at our politics as well. We have like the Tories and we have Labour, and those parties shift about a bit on their own axis. But the popular politics has never really gone any further right than the Tories or any further left than Labour. Not just because of first past the post where they're the only two parties who can get anywhere. But the extreme parties, bar UKIP, which is kind of like, but that was mostly because a lot of people didn't like the EU and that played on anti-immigrant sentiment. But we've never gone in for like extreme nutcase parties. We haven't had the popularity and those parties haven't enjoyed popularity here that they have enjoyed other places. And I don't think there's anyone who lives here who's ever looked at China and just thought, well, I could probably stomach their regime because I don't mind my freedom's been taken away. We value it too much, I think, here. I mean, if you look at every part of our culture, really, satire is huge here because we like the freedom to throw daggers at effigies of politicians or burn Boris Johnson instead of Guy Fawkes on a bonfire, which I've seen a few. I think we like doing that here, and I don't think anyone here would ever give that up, which is good. I like that about where we live. I think I like that attitude, particularly as you see it from everyone here. You don't, no matter really what walk of life it is or what political axis they go on. People like the freedom to say whatever they like and criticize people.
Interesting thing though is that like when this is, I completely agree that England is like an interesting case. I mean, obviously it's the case we're most familiar with, and we're all going to be a bit more sentimental towards it, given we all live here. But I think it's interesting that a lot of the time this isn't necessarily dictators, but more authoritarian rulers. So if you look at in Brazil, right, they often come in the stance of, oh, I'm here to protect your rights, I'm here to give you your rights, right? So it's the kind of thing where he's trying to implement like more gun laws, which he is presenting as a human right, if that makes sense. Like for us, that sounds completely bizarre and backwards. Obviously, that is interesting that a lot of these times these figures who we from an external perspective think, oh dear, here comes the marginalization of groups, here comes, look at there's going to be a reduced intolerance to the LGBTQ plus community and onwards, is actually often internally presented by its supporters as a time to protect the individual liberties which have been taken away by we see as, I guess, political progression and social improvement. I think it's important to remember that I think most systems do at least at the beginning say, oh, we're actually improving your personal liberties. It's just then whether that's a true statement or whether that is just a temporary thing before it fluxes into something like a dictatorship, which then is of course not at all supportive of individual liberty.
On that note, I want to carry us on a bit to the next section, which is about something quite recently about this intelligence collection in Wuhan and whether we should place the burden on China to expose the truth about where the coronavirus came from. How should China respond to these calls for investigations in the COVID-19 outbreak? As it is a nationalist state, should we still place that expectation on them for a global pandemic to actively work towards finding out what was the root cause, even if it's not necessarily in their nation's interest?
I mean, I think they certainly should investigate where it came from, and I think it would be in everyone's interest to do it. But I don't think they think that, really. Again, there's the problem you have. It's difficult to make them do things. So I think, yeah, they should definitely investigate this because we need to know whether it came from. I don't know if I believe that it was developed in a laboratory. It could have been, it could not have been. It's entirely conceivable that China might have had a go at something like that in a laboratory. But we don't know whether that's the case or not. So they should really investigate to find out. But I doubt they're going to, if I'm honest, because again, they're pretty sharp, they're pretty coy about giving up their data about the way their nation works behind the scenes. If they had, for argument's sake, actually developed this stuff in a laboratory, I don't think they'd be too enthusiastic about telling people that. They probably aren't going to hold up arms and go, oh yeah, no, this was our fault, sorry. So I think they should investigate this, but I doubt they will, if I'm honest. Beyond just going, no, we also, if they do say they've investigated it and found no evidence of it, are we going to take their word for it? Because again, they're quite economical with their truth and they're economical with their data. So even if they did investigate this, how would you assess the veracity of any of the findings they've come up with? It's not like they're going to say, we've got some independent experts from all around the world to have a look at this. They're going to do their own report on this if they do a report on it. So it would be very difficult to actually ascertain any worthwhile results from this, even if they did it.
If it finds out that China did develop this in a laboratory, and I'm not saying that they did or they didn't, nobody knows, but they'd then take responsibility for the spread of it throughout the world and actually for the global pandemic as a whole.
Well, I mean, if they made it and they let it get out, then you could easily point the finger and say, well, you let this loose, so you do have to bear kind of some of the blame. Of course, then you then have the question of how much of the effects of the pandemic is to blame with how governments handled it or just the virus itself, which I mean would then be the question that probably they hid behind if they're in this scenario. But it would also be a very relevant question. So they could probably, in the scenario where it turned out they did accidentally release this, then you could certainly put the blame for starting the thing on them. But I think probably a lot of people would be more interested in trying to pin the blame for the effects it's had on their lives on how their own governments have handled it.
But then I guess it raises that question, for China at least, which is more damaging to them? Rumors, so speculation such as this, or the actual truth? So is it in their interest to let people keep theorizing? So like you've got scientists debating, was it a natural animal to human transmission, or was it actually caused by a lab outbreak? Or is it more beneficial for China to actually make the investigation and find out what happened? And I guess that's something they're going to have to weigh up.
I mean, I don't know if anyone's seen this, but the Anthony Fauci is essentially the American equivalent of Chris Whitty. He had his emails leaked. He didn't manage to quite escape it like Hillary Clinton did. But and essentially what he had in his inbox was rather explosive, and it's made the American right have an absolute meltdown. But that's besides the point. Is that China, essentially, he has this scientist who's telling him, no, China definitely made this, and here's why. And it's actually a very detailed sort of report on why China made the virus. But then obviously you've got this sort of, scientists are really butting heads over this. I mean, they're seriously sort of coming together and saying, look, we've really got to work this one out. And there's a lot of conflicting opinions. Obviously, it's all tied up in politics and veracity and sort of what political persuasion is the scientist, etc., etc. And I think that there's going to be a lot of uproar about this. And if China is found guilty of creating the coronavirus, then it's certainly got to pay its dues to the international community. I mean, long have the days passed since we let powers, just because they were large, one would hope so anyway, get away with doing something like this, and something on such a great scale that has affected everyone, and I mean seriously everyone in the world. And I think that China has, and if they're going to have to bear it economically. But I don't think that China is going to be, first of all, able to cover the entire costs of the pandemic, because I mean, who on earth could? And obviously you have the influence of other governments in the efficacy of, say, their lockdown strategies and whether they are to blame for the spread of the coronavirus within their own nation.
Because plenty of people have been saying for ages that China released this on purpose, and now they've gravitated towards this as their holy grail of evidence that they were waiting for. I think the question of whether China does do its own investigation really comes from, because as you were saying, Nikki, about whether or not they let the rumours rumble on or not. Basically, they'll take the view, if I were them, I'd take the view, well, how are these rumours being treated? If they're starting to be believed, and if the emails could represent a step towards people starting to think more, becoming a more popular view that China did release this. I think it's only beneficial for China to do its own investigation if people take the idea that they released it seriously. And now if you have scientists who start to say maybe that did happen, then maybe people will start to take it seriously. It depends, though, because as Richard said, there's lots of different opinions on this, and no one knows for sure yet. if I were China, really, at the moment, I wouldn't do anything because I don't think there's not that much of a movement that's saying that it's China's fault for it to be taken seriously. But I think if it was taken seriously and the world's governments did start actually asking the question to China, then I as China, would create my own report that said I was clean as a whistle, which I think is probably what they will do if they ever have to investigate this or are forced to investigate this. They'll just produce a little ticket that says no evidence, nothing to see here. That'll solve and not solve the problem. It won't establish whether or not this is actually true because no one's going to take them at their word. But at the same time, China's going to go, well, we did investigate it. What more do you want? We're not going to let you investigate it in our country, so we consider the matter closed.
What we're going to see more and more of is countries, governments who have handled the pandemic poorly, looking for almost like a buyout, as in who can we blame? Yeah, a scapegoat. Who can we blame? Oh, we don't necessarily have the best relationships with this country anyway, and let's kind of give credit to these rumours and this speculation because it helps us in the long run, as the governments would be thinking, because it makes sense for them to kind of almost blame out them rather than blame in, because that will destabilise their government and therefore it kind of spirals downwards. And I think that's probably what we will see more and more of happening, especially within the next 12 months as vaccinations start to be rolled out and we start to see, hopefully, the end of this. I need some wood to touch because, my God, yeah. And yeah, I think we will see more and more of other countries, other governments start to look around for answers to kind of stop them becoming the sole focus of the media attention within their country. And perhaps that is why China will do an investigation, if at all. Because
to rob people of doing that. To rob people of being them, basically.
Effectively, yeah.
I think that's quite likely, to be honest. If I'm speaking personally, though, I don't know quite how successful that will be. I think they'll definitely try that. I think you're right. But personally, I think if they did try and do that, I don't think certainly here, I don't think they get very far because people would quite reasonably go, well, yeah, they released it, but you still up dealing with it.
I guess I was thinking just now, Biden's called for intelligence to look into it, giving them, I don't know how long. I know it was quite a short time frame. I want to say, any idea, Richard?
Well, I think I'm not sure, but it's about 3 or 4 months. But I think the move from Biden to do so is essentially a given of what the US leader would have been, and obviously Biden is not, shall we say, chummy with China, but he's less opposed to it than say Trump was, because obviously Trump was just off his head with China. But I think that Biden essentially he is trying to establish the facts. I don't think that he's trying to sort of collude with China or all of these sort of silly conspiracy theories. He's not. He's genuinely attempting to assess the facts of the matter. And I think that America, I don't like America as the protector, but it's going to have to be the protector against China in this case because it is the world's biggest economy. Obviously, first in front of China. And I think that if we're going to have any establishment of any real facts and we're going to defend against what Alex was saying, which I see that more than likely, then America is going to have to spearhead this charge. And I think they already are, especially the Republicans, because they want to embarrass the Democrats, because they always do. They want to go full steam ahead with this, with investigating China, and essentially, well, they want to establish that it was a lab leak, and the rest of us just want to know the facts of the matter.
I wonder, though, I mean, even if we do find out that it was a lab leak and we do try and impose stuff on China, it is still going to be difficult. I wonder how far that would go, really. Because even if it does come out that and China does agree to give any aid out as a result of it, I wonder how much they would give and how far that would be useful to people.
I guess that's the main question, isn't it? How do you compensate for a global pandemic? Like, this is unprecedented. How do you dole out money? Do you talk about the potential that someone could have earned had they not died from the virus, that kind of thing? Are we talking individual? Are we talking governments? And then you bring in all sorts of issues about social inequality, that sort of thing.
It's impossible to calculate. It is impossible to calculate.
No matter which way you calculate it, not everyone is going to be happy. You will always end up with a loser in that situation. And it may not even necessarily be China. It may be some other countries that end up losing out within this kind of compensation situation.
Even if you look within the UK, and the government is directly spending into job creation, investment in infrastructure, the loser in this is kind of us in a really pathetic sense in education spending and kind of making up for. And there is always, I completely agree, there is always going to be a loser in it. If you look on a government level, if you look on an international level, there is always somebody or something which is going to lose out.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to work through as well. It's a difficult thing to calculate, and you're right, yeah, there'll definitely be a loser as well. And at the end of the day, if there is any compensation, it's going to be given to a government, and then that government is going to have to decide how to spend it. And then you're going to end up with more criticisms over how they're going to spend that, which will probably take the focus away from where that money actually came from in the end. And also, we were talking earlier about China's economic dominance. If they're suddenly giving payouts to the rest of the world, and then they don't take the rap for how those payments are distributed, they might go up in some people's estimation, which brings, like Richard was saying, some people who are less inclined to democratic freedom anyway, might suddenly look and see China giving out a lot of money to people after the recovery from the pandemic and graciously admitting responsibility. Not that I think they'd ever do that personally, but if they did, it might play well for China. So maybe they will do it because they think it might play well for them.
To be honest, they're always forward looking, aren't they? Like, you could see that if you look at their presence in renewable energy. Like, they were targeting renewable energy far before USA or UK were looking into it, and they're starting to dominate that market now. And you can see their political motivations very much feed into their economic ambitions, and that's kind of pushing them forward, because end of the day, what they want is to be the dominant global presence within the world.
What's very interesting is that China sort of looks at what's trendy, shall we say, in sort of like 30 years ago, obviously, no one was sort of saying, oh, well, we've got to invest in all of this green stuff, whip out the solar panels. It was sort of, it was all sort of these trendy environments in the West, and there was sort of very much a minority of the population. But China is often, and I'm not quite sure how, it has played sort of a masterstroke of being able to predict what is going to be popular and what is going to be also right. Even despite the fact that China isn't going to use any of this technology, I mean, it's not. I believe it's the highest emitter of pollutants into the atmosphere and into the waters of any country on the planet. But they are able to sort of cop out almost to the West, saying, look, here's all our wonderful solar panels and wind farms and hydroelectric dams, etc., etc. And I think that they are, and if they continue to do that, then China, as you say, will become, and without any sort of refutation from the West, will become the economic superpower, and the superpower. All of the other ones will be assumed from their positions. The USA, Germany, UK, Italy, whatever, will be gone.
And I guess on that note, we can wrap it up. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, this has been a fantastic discussion panel, and I hope everyone listening has enjoyed it.